The North Koreans facing another famine. 10 million are hungry because of the worst drought in 4 decades. Could their suffering force the North to abandon its ballistic missile development and restart denuclearisation talks with Donald Trump? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. An estimated 2 million North Koreans died during the famine in the 1990s. Aid workers are calling for international help to prevent history repeating itself or worse. Even North Korean state media are sounding the alarm. The official news agency is reporting the worst drought in 37 years, and it blames economic sanctions for making matters worse. North Koreans are being urged to fight what's called a war against nature to find new water sources and protect crops. The United Nations has just reported the lowest harvest in a decade and has warned that millions are going hungry. South Korea is sending cash to help.
정부는 북한 주민에 대한 인도적 지원은
Our government has decided to provide $8 million to international organizations' projects to support North Korea, including the World Food Programme and UNICEF, based on our stance that we continue humanitarian aid for North Korean people, regardless of political situations.
Well, before we move on to our discussion, let's take a quick look at the situation in North Korea. The capital, Pyongyang, should have received an average of 170 millimeters of rain by May. State media say the entire country has recorded only 54 millimeters so far. That's the lowest since 1982. This year's harvest is expected to suffer. The World Food Programme estimates that at least 40% of the 25 million population suffer food shortages. The United Nations says people are receiving just 300 grams of food rations a day. That's half the government's target. The last famine in the 1990s is thought to have killed up to 2 million people. North Korea's government never released an official total. All right, let's bring in our guest now from Augusta in Georgia in the United States. By Skype is Han Park, a founding director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. From Beijing, we have Gita Rabol, who's advocacy manager for the country cluster support team. That's at the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. And by Skype, from Exeter in the United Kingdom is Aidan Foster Carter, an honorary senior research fellow in sociology and modern career at Leeds University. Thank you all for joining us. Gita Rabol, if I could start with you from the Red Cross. You have people on the ground there. Give us an idea of the scale of the problem in North Korea right now.
Well, it's not just one bad year. It's one bad year after the worst year in a decade. I mean, it looks really, really bad. We have people there been visiting 3 provinces and in the communities. All I can say now is that it's not getting better. They made an assessment and the report will be out next week. So unfortunately, I can't comment on that yet. But it is really bad. We see malnutrition, we see undernutrition that is chronic. And we also might see now the effect that there is no water, there's no safe water for drinking or for cooking. So what we might be seeing now is also new cases of diarrhea and diseases like that.
And I understand
so it's really bad.
It's around about 40% of the population, Gita, and out of that 40%, as usual in these situations, it's the elderly and the very young who are most at risk.
Yeah, it's the children. It's the children. I mean, 20% of all children under 5 are stunted. They don't get any near the nutrition they need. It's pregnant women. It's women who are breastfeeding their children, and it's the elderly. So once again, those are the most who suffers, or those are suffer the most.
Right. And is this a picture across the whole country, or is it a specific part of North Korea?
Well, it differs. It differs. But of course, there are some provinces that are in worse shape than others. I don't have the full picture of that, but I can say there are differences. But still, even though you're not living in one of those provinces, maybe you're used to getting some food from some relatives who live there. So it's a very large deal of the population that can feel this.
And finally, at this stage, Gita, I know you can't talk specifically about the report that's coming out, but if things do keep going in this direction, do you think we could see a repeat of the terrible, terrible events of the 1990s when hundreds
Well,
of
I
thousands
think
of
it
people
is.
died?
It is already. Yeah. Well, I think it is already terrible. It's hard to measure terrible, but I mean, it's not just bad getting worse. Now it is really worse, bordering on alarming. I would say that.
Okay, well, that's the situation. Gita, thanks very much. Let's bring in Han Park. Obviously, Han, you've been to North Korea many times, 50 or so times. We talked about this event back in the 90s. Do you think we're heading in the same direction now?
The fact that North Korea has a serious problem is well established. We don't have to go over that. The question is, what can we do? The world around the peninsula, especially the United States and China, are very powerful and rich countries, and South Korea may also be included here as potential donors or helpers in this regard for North Koreans. South Korea is prepared to do that, already offered $8 million, but South Korea can send rice and other humanitarian assistance directly across the border, and China can do likewise. So I think it is so important that we do not include the sanction in this equation, because political sanction in the area of food and humanitarian necessity mounts to weapons against the country. It's a very, very serious weapon.
Okay, so you think that the sanctions are weaponizing the issue of food. We'll come on to the geopolitics more in just a moment, Han, but Aidan Foster-Carter, if I could bring you in from Exeter in the UK. They say that climate change is to blame for this, lack of snow during the winter, leaving crops exposed to freezing temperatures, as well as prolonged dry spells due to rainfall that's lower than predictable and less predictable. To what degree, first of all, before we get into the geopolitics, to what degree can North Korea prepare for such events as this and deal with them without outside help?
The North Korean government could do a great deal more than it does. It could do, here's an example. We know from the United Nations panel of experts set up to monitor sanctions and their impact and the ways North Korea avoids them. That panel of experts claims that in recent years, North Korea earned more than $500 million from cyber fraud, essentially, various things, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, raiding banks, and so on. Well, obviously, they shouldn't have done that, but that means they have a cash pile. They choose to spend their money differently. Most countries, normal countries, countries with any degree of care for their citizens or responsibility to their citizens, would be importing food. That if they're not importing food on any scale, if they're not increasing their imports, as far as we know, that's a political choice. Economics 101 always says, to give an example of the choices all governments face, guns versus butter. It's very literally true in the North Korean case. So though I have, obviously intense sympathy for the very long-suffering North Korean people, this government could do what other governments do, even before we get on to things that are obviously it's not going to do, like denuclearize and generally change its spending patterns. They could do a lot more. They could also change the way the economic system is organized, if I can briefly mention that. Sensible communist regimes like China and Vietnam long ago, 30 years ago and more, gave more responsibility to enterprises, to farms, broke up collective farms. North Korea has been tinkering with a bit of that, and of course they've got a very difficult situation. The soil is exhausted. There's a lot of that sort of thing we could go into. They haven't got much to work with. They haven't got many margins at the best of times. But they're really, they're not doing these things. The regime has brought, I can't say they brought it upon themselves, because that would sound callous, but the regime has brought it upon the people. Unfortunately, the people are going to suffer and not the regime.
So Aidan, on that front, to what degree then does sanctions have an impact on the North Korea as a country being able to deal with a situation like this?
They do, and there's no doubt about that. I mean, what has happened, because there's now, a 10-year history of sanctions, and in the beginning, North Korea's first nuclear test, 2006, all that time ago, the sanctions were confined to its arms trade. But in the last 2 or 3 years, they got tighter and tighter since the North Koreans took not a blind bit of notice of any of these, I may say, unanimous United Nations Security Council sanctions voted for by Russia and China, as well as other members. So they tightened up. So basically, a lot of North Korea's main exports are now banned, and it's hard for them to import. So things like oil at the margins and food as such, of course, is not affected, but things that are help for agriculture. From NGOs on the ground, and I'm sure your Red Cross person would know more, from the field than I do. There's no way that this cannot. Sorry, there's too many negatives. Sanctions certainly don't help. So that's a huge dilemma for policy, because clearly.
And Gitta, from your point of view, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of sanctions and the kind of impact that they have in restricting the nation's ability to carry on?
Well, that's difficult for me to say, and as you know, Red Cross, we're not about politics. We don't take sides. We do the humanitarian work on the ground that is possible for us to do. And we cooperate. In doing that, we cooperate with the National Red Cross Society, and they are in all the affected areas. And so what we do is, well, to provide the water pumps needed to make sure that we can do things on the ground that would help here and now. And of course, we also do things to prevent or to prepare this for happening by building greenhouses. But it's a different scale than the geopolitical talk. I know that, but I'm not able to comment on that.
All right, okay. Well, I'll take that on with Hannah in a second. But you mentioned this issue of irrigation equipment and water pumps, and to combat the problem, the state-run Rondong Sinum newspaper has called for a war. What they describe as a war has been translated as a war against nature, mobilizing all available water pumps and irrigation equipment. To what degree, and we come back to this question of how capable North Korea is capable of dealing with a situation like this, to what degree does North Korea have this kind of equipment to hand, and how much outside help does it need?
I don't know the scale of that, but I know that in 2018 it actually helped that we were able to, and they were able to provide some water pump for the affected areas. Right now, people are carrying water in water buckets out in the afternoons and at night. And of course, having water pumps, having fuel for those water pumps, having tents to cover them from the heat, all these, it sounds like small things, but this is actually what will help the crops to grow and the people to get fed. But it doesn't solve the whole crisis. Of course it doesn't, but it we come a good way.
So, Gitta, just one more thing. Can you tell us about the issue of food rationing in North Korea? I understand that most citizens, something like 70%, live off, 500 grams of food a day, and even that is going to have to now be cut to 300 grams a day.
And that's very, very little if you think of what the rest of us are consuming. I mean, it will barely keep the people alive. I mean, it is really bad, and you can see the malnutrition on the ground. You can see how this affects. We just, like I said, have our people been visiting different communities, and it's clear to see there that there isn't enough. There is a lack. There's a lack of everything, and they're not used to much. They're used to these rations over the last years that they are getting smaller. But this year, if something is not happening, it's really getting worse.
Okay, and Hannah, you talked a little while ago about
it's a week.
Sure,
yeah.
And Hannah, you talked about this issue of weaponizing food, if you like. What do you say to those who say that North Korea want to make it sound like sanctions equal starvation? So, the United States really should be benevolent towards them.
Unfortunately, no country in the world would give in their security interests for food aid or economic development. We're expecting North Korea to do that. They will not. And North Korea would like to maintain its socialist system, its collective kind of system, and continuously. That's what Russia and China want as well. So that if we expect North Korea to change its political system characteristics altogether in order to get IMF or World Bank assistance, I think we should look at somewhere else. North Korea is not going to give in to these kind of international pressures. They would rather, as we saw in 1970s, 1990s, they will rather have a lot of starvations. It's on the rise. So it is a matter of world public opinion, and weaponizing food works in North Korea, but works only in the sense a lot of people will suffer rather than changing their military or political postures. So it's a difficult situation now. The world would have to adjust it to that situation.
Aidan Foster-Carter, what do you think about that? This concept that the North Korean government may be kind of playing on the issue of food supplies in North Korea, or using it, I should say, to aid its geopolitical position, certainly in negotiations with the United States?
Oh, I'm sure they're using it. I mean, the North Korean government is a very skilled operator. It's a very cynical, and I think it's a contemptibly immoral operator. And if I understood Dr. Park correctly, he seems to suggest that we should all just put up with that. We're over a barrel, of course. And what hasn't been mentioned yet, I mean, even kindly South Korea offering a modest 8 million. I'd love to know what Dr. Park thinks of the fact that North Korea has more or less spat back in their faces and criticized them for daring to offer this. It's incredibly, for anybody who believes in a peaceful and better world and an international order. Sure, any country wants its security. Thankfully, most countries in the world, most small countries in the world, do not think that their security consists of getting a nuclear weapons, getting intercontinental ballistic missiles, threatening the world. I mean, I call it militant mendicancy. North Korea is a mugger and a beggar at the same time. And it's infuriating. But of course, we don't want the people to suffer. The North Korean government doesn't care about its people one bit, but we care. And that's the intense dilemma. But let there be no doubt about it is not reasonable for the North Korean government to behave as it does in any way.
Han Park, North Korea, a mugger and a beggar at the same time. What do you say to that?
Oh, yeah, I think empirically that may bear some truthfulness. But in reality, North Korea has its own goals, and North Korea will never give up completely their nuclear capability. And they're not going to give up their socialist system, collective ownership, and denial of capitalism and all that. If we expect North Korea to do those things in exchange for food aid and humanitarian aid, we are wrong. It will not work. It has never worked for decades.
And what do you think, Han Park, about the fact that this is being talked about now, partly because the North Koreans themselves have asked for help and being very bold in asking for help and very public about it?
Yeah, but we'll see. But the kind of pressure that the United States, through John Bolton's idea, it is not going to work. Follow the Libya model. So North Korea will not just want economic prosperity, it wants socialist North Korea kind of economic prosperity. We'll see, but China will help in that regard.
Aidan Foster-Parker, you want to come in there?
Well, there's so much that one could say. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation. There must be a way. I mean, you can have. What point can I pick up on? As I said before, sensible communist regimes, as in China and in Vietnam, you can keep political control. I mean, whether or not one likes that system. But if we're talking about, and I think incidentally, we shouldn't say North Korea when we mean the Kim family regime, the clique who have got the rest of the country in their grip. Right. It's them that we're talking about. In other socialist countries, they've dared to try, and they've got China was very impoverished under Mao. And much nastier than it is now. China is now a world power by doing sensible things economically. You can do sensible things economically, and a communist party can keep power. Kim Jong-un is a bit more daring than his father, Kim Jong-il, but unfortunately not very much. There is so much more they could do and should do. The trouble is they are very stubborn, and we don't really have the leverage.
So, Gita Rabol, we've been talking about this $8 million that the South is going to mobilize to supply the North Korean administration to provide food and medicines and so forth. To what degree will that even touch the sides of what's required there? How much more is needed?
Oh, I don't want to put a number on this, because I think all the help they can get will reach some people and will do some good. But of course, everybody can when you talk about more than 10 million people not getting the food they need, 40% of the population. When you talk about chronic under and malnutrition, you know that it takes a lot to reach all these people. But, I mean, all the help they can get.
And Han Park,
do
what
some good.
Moon Jae-in is doing in the south and sending this money north, it doesn't actually have that much support in South Korea. There are those who say that the north has squandered resources, as we've been discussing here, on its nuclear arms program that it should have used to help its people. Let me quote one spokeswoman for the Conservative Korea Liberty Party who said, "This is a time to stop aid, if there is any going to the north, not to provide it." She accuses Mr. Moon of irresponsible appeasement.
Yes, what is happening in North Korea will eventually, more likely sooner than later, will affect South Koreans as well. They're thinking about some sort of reunification or peaceful coexistence. If North Koreans are starving and children are not growing, not given enough nutrition, then the people as a whole, North and South Korea combined, will suffer. The impact will be there. So South Korea is concerned very seriously about North Korean economic situation, food situation, and willing to help North Korea, this current regime, but following American lead. It's so important that the United States show the world that North Koreans have the right to life, not just to freedom, but to life. So we're denying actually North Korean children's lives because of the nuclear situation. So we should not weaponize food for that purpose.
And Aidan Foster Carter, as the United States look on at this situation, they would have been very well aware of the impending crisis that's affecting millions of people in North Korea as they continue their negotiations or go back and forth with the administration in North Korea. How much of a factor do you think this crisis is in how they play their hand?
Sad to say, I mean, as far as I would assess it, not very much at all. I mean, you know, working out what matters to Donald Trump, apart from Donald Trump himself, is really quite difficult. The trouble is, and I think we have to say a little bit about the broader context, and again, interpretations vary, but Han Park and I might agree on this, and the Red Cross has no politics, as we know, but Trump has blown it. I mean, I had hoped, you know, I was very hopeful about the various peace processes and summits that we had last year, 2018, seemed to be history already, unfortunately. I thought we were going to get from the long, vicious circles we've had into a virtuous one, where South Korea, this government which does want to help the North, could go ahead, starting with things like joint ventures, with reconnecting and rebuilding roads and railways, so that you could actually suck North Korea gradually or tempt it, lure it into a more benevolent relationship with the outside world. I think that was a possibility. Trump blew that at Hanoi. Well, Kim Jong-un blew it as well by not really conceding anything at all. I guess we don't have time for too much detail on that, but there is that broader context. And to come back to your question now, I don't think Trump gives, I can't say that, can I? I don't think Trump cares very much about the welfare of the North Korean people.
Han Park, with 40% of the population in trouble in North Korea, what about the other 60%? Would they be aware of the situation, or is it kept under wraps as far as they're concerned? Is it managed, this crisis?
Yeah, North Korea is remarkably egalitarian society. Everyone is hungry. If 40% are dying of starvation, the rest of 60% are very hungry. So the whole country is in serious trouble, but they're not going to give away their security asset, which is their nuclear capability. They have declared that they are already nuclear power, so we can deal with North Korea as the way it is. So we don't have to publicly acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear state, but we just move on. And denuclearization is important, but more importantly, the expansion, the non-proliferation of nuclear capability is just as important. So we should move on to non-proliferation as opposed to denuclearization in the case of North Korea.
Certainly a very troubling and worrying situation, and one that we will watch very closely here at Al Jazeera. That's all we have time for. Thanks very much to all our guests, to Han Park, Digita Rabol and Aidan Foster Carter. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.